Us a little bit of a review where we've been the last 2 weeks, then we'll jump into what the Lord has for us. Because the last 2 weeks and this week, a third week, we are into this intermediate part of the book in Romans. We've been in Romans 9 through 11. We've been through Romans 9 through 11. And in this piece, we get to Romans 9, and Paul has been sharing the gospel and what everything the gospel is about. People are saying, well, what about the Jewish people who are God's chosen people? You think they would have received Jesus, and has God failed them? Has the promise failed them? And Paul is saying, no, it has not failed them. And also the question is, they're saying, what is God doing through their rebellion? So let's do a quick little thought into this. In Romans chapter 9, we see that Israel's rejection is now outside of God's sovereign plan. But yet it's through the promises that have been passed down and through his hard hearts that he has shaped, and he still had his plan of salvation go forward. We're going to see today in Romans 10, God's desire is for all people to come to salvation in him. And in Romans 11, we're going to see that Israel has not been cast away. Rather, it's God's mercy that extends to all people, as we're going to see they're grafted into the family. The big picture, though, we've said is asking the question, how does God's redemptive plan unfold? Not only in our lives, but through history as well. We've asked, have you received God's redemptive plan of your own life? And we've talked about that all the way through, that salvation is not something we can attain. It's not in of works. It's something only received by faith in Jesus Christ. And then we're going to see today, though, also what happens when we receive God's redemptive plan. What happens when that happens? So as we jump in to this specific part, as we kind of wrap up Romans 9 through 11, this piece that he's writing, we're going to pray and ask the Lord to speak to us, and then we'll jump into what he has for us. Lord, we thank you for this great opportunity to come to you, and as we kind of finish this section of Romans, that we would hear from you. And in Romans 9, 10, 11, it's about God's redemptive plan, that it hasn't failed for the people of Israel. Rather, it's opened the door to the whole world. And Lord, I pray that we would have clear direction from you this morning. We would hear from you. In Jesus' name, amen. The word we're going to use today, or a big idea, is on the topic of confession. And we're going to look at this idea in a couple different ways. Well, first off, the man on my left, he confessed to himself, he confessed to the world around him of a $65 billion Ponzi scheme that he had, and where he got about $18 billion out of people, swindled them. He confessed himself, which his confession then led him to 150 years of jail time. I'm interested to see how someone serves 150 years. I have seen that, science is catching up and maybe people will live a little bit longer, but it's interesting to see. The man on my right, it was actually somebody else's confession, that he was in prison for 8 years. And someone else's confession actually released him because they thought that this man right here was in prison. And he's walking by down the block one day, and he sees a guy that looks kind of like him. And he begins to think to himself, maybe that's who I got mixed up with. Come to find out, build a relationship with the guy, and the guy confesses to the crime they thought he committed, and he's released. So confession does that as well. And we're going to see here in Romans 10 this idea that Paul is really bringing Romans 9, 10, 11 together, of that really this promise is for anybody who turns from their sin. And it says here, if you openly declare or confess that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Before we get to that, we're going to kind of build up to that a little bit from Romans 10. We're going to begin in verse 5. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. If not, it'll be up on the screen for us as well. Before we get to the idea of in verse 9, if you openly confess, Paul starts off like this. He says this, for Moses writes that the law's way of making a person right with God requires obedience to all of its commands. So again, like we've talked about time and time again, God gave the Jewish people laws, 613 of them, And basically the idea was this: if you could obey them perfectly, you're good. And no one could. Right? That's all of us. We all fall short of God's standard. He says, but faith's way of getting right with God says this: don't say in your heart, who will go up to heaven to bring Christ down to earth. And don't say, who will go down to the place of the dead to bring Christ back to life again. In fact, it says, the message is very close at hand. It is on your lips and in your heart. The first thing that's happening here is he's saying, yeah, when you look at your life stacked up to God's laws, you might be like, it's impossible to do this. And you might say, well, then it's so hard to be saved. And he's referring back to Moses in Deuteronomy, and he is saying, no, salvation is not that far off. It's not so far unattainable because it's what God did for us by sending his son Jesus. We've talked about two things a lot in the book of Romans: how Paul is constantly referring back to the Old Testament, and how he constantly uses legal terms to give clarity to what he's sharing. A lot of times I've seen people try to interpret Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11 without going back to the Old Testament. You can't really do that because he's always referring to it, quoting it. So in fact here, he's actually quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 30. It says this is the command I'm giving you today. It's not too difficult for you. It is not beyond your reach. It is not kept in heaven, so distant that you must ask, who will go up to heaven and bring it down so we can hear it and obey? It is not beyond the sea, so far away that you must ask, who will cross the sea to bring it to us so we can hear it and obey? No, the message is very close at hand. It's on your lips and in your heart so that you can obey it. It's attainable. Promised land. He says this, now listen, today I am giving you a choice between life and death, between prosperity and disaster. Oftentimes you hear Romans 9, 10, 11, is that God is up there choosing what happens, right? That, oh, you get mercy and you don't get mercy, or you're destined for this, you're not destined for this. And we've seen in Romans 9, 10, 11, the divine working of God's sovereign plan alongside of our free will. And he says, today I am giving you a choice between life and death. And then he leads us back into Romans 10. He's saying, hey, with this in mind, he says this, and that message is the very message we preach about. And is the very message about faith that we preach. So he says, this message in Deuteronomy is the same message we're preaching today of faith. Then he says, if you openly declare or confess that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And so that word confess, I was like, what does that word actually mean? Right? You know how our English words don't always align with how the word was originally written in the culture. And the word he uses here is actually it's a legal word. It's a judicial term. And it indicates a binding and public declaration which settles a relationship with legal force. And so what he's saying was when you openly declare, openly confess, as Romans 5:1 says, we now have peace with God. It's a legal thing. Our relationship with God is restored through Jesus Christ. So what do you have to confess then to be saved? You have to confess Jesus is Lord. You need to confess that God raised him from the dead. Paul would say in Corinthians, if Jesus was not raised from the dead, your faith is useless. This is what you must confess. Think about it. Do you share a testimony of coming to faith in Christ? And how do these two things fit into it? You know, what's interesting is I was looking around on this idea of confession. There's a whole center out there for people who have confessed to things they didn't do. Behind me is a screen, and these are all faces of people who confess to things they never did. There's actually a whole psychological science behind why people confess to things they never did. You can find stories of people who are in the heated moment after 16 hours of interrogation that'll just say, yes, I did it, even though they didn't do it at all. And sometimes that can be like our own testimony. We have to be mindful when we share, how did you come to faith in Jesus Christ? And sometimes people say, you know what? I just grew up in church my whole life. I've always known him. It doesn't really fit with something like this. It says at some point you have to confess Jesus as your Lord. You must confess that God raised him from the dead. Again, he's not saying, well, you got to come up in front of church to do that. I'm not even necessarily sure that it has to be like something verbally that you say in your car, but like it's with your life that you're making this statement. And oftentimes I would go back to the individual and I'll say, but tell me that time that you knew. Where's that time you took that step over the line? And that's for all of us, right? It's not like osmosis. Just because you walk into church your whole life, you're saved. Or what Paul was talking about, Paul's talking in more context here. The last couple weeks in Romans 9 and 10 and 11, one of the questions has been kind of like, just because your grandfather's saved doesn't make you saved. Hey, Israel, just because you came from Abraham doesn't make you saved. Just because you came through the line of Isaac and Jacob and you're one of the 12 tribes doesn't make you saved. It was that if you confessed Jesus as your Lord, that you are saved. And then he goes on here, and he says, for it is by believing in your heart that you are made right with God. And it is by openly declaring your faith that you are saved. As the scriptures say, anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. And then he says this, again, a huge portion of 9, 10, and 11. He says, Jew and Gentile are the same in this respect. They have the same Lord who gives generously to all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So I went back and I did some deep study on this. Really deep study. Okay, so this word I have highlighted down here says anyone. This other word here says everyone. Do you want to know what the translations of these words are? Anyone and everyone. I know it's pretty mind-blowing, but that's what he means. Anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And so this is where Paul, in the middle of 9, 10, 11, blows this wide open. He's saying just because you're a Jew doesn't get you in. Just because you obeyed the law that you think to your way doesn't get you in. Anyone and everyone, whether you're a Jew or Gentile, who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Again, if you weren't here the past 2 weeks, the context of those things makes a lot more sense for this, so you may need to go back and rewatch that or watch it for the first time. Let me give one more thing to this. Now, we say that we are not saved by works. And you might say, well, my confession is my work. How is it not a work? I'm doing something. Well, we already cleared that up in Romans 4, where Paul was talking about the faith of Abraham. And he says, for the scriptures tell us, Abraham believed God, and God counted to him as righteous because of his faith. When people work, their wages are not a gift, but something they've earned. But people are counted as righteous, not because of their work, but because of their faith in God who forgives sinners. And so he differentiates there that faith is not a work. Confessing Jesus as Lord is not a work. It's not something you do. It's just what takes place in your life to receive what Jesus did for you. It's the acknowledgement, it's the confession that you're ready for Jesus to be your Lord. And the ultimate question you need to ask is, have you received God's redemption plan? Because there's something else that Paul leads us to in Romans 11 that says, now what happens? When you confess Jesus as Lord, what happens? We're going to turn the page real quick to Romans 11. And in Romans 11:17, he begins like this. But some of these branches from Abraham's tree, some of the people of Israel, have been broken off. He's leading us into the way of that being the open door. And you Gentiles, who were branches from a wild olive tree, have been grafted in. So now you also receive the blessing God has promised Abraham and his children, sharing in rich nourishment from the root of God's special olive tree. So he says here, when you confess Jesus as Lord, he gives you the imagery of an olive tree and being grafted into it. Grafted into it. And he says, but you must not brag about being grafted in to replace the branches that were broken off. You were just a branch, not the root. Well, you may say, those branches were broken off to make room for me. Paul again is referring here, as we look at the big picture of Romans 9, 10, and 11, of how the Jews, many of them, rebelled and chose not to follow the way of Jesus. And he's saying those were broken off. God actually used their hard hearts to make salvation known to the whole world. Again, Paul referring to the Old Testament, in Jeremiah 11:16, it says, "The Lord once called you a thriving olive tree with fruit in beautiful form, but not any longer." And so this is what he's giving. When you make that confession to faith in Jesus Christ, it says you are grafted in to the olive tree. And so I'm not really sure. I've never seen it happen, but I looked it up, and it's a common practice that makes an olive tree stronger, or it diversifies its fruit. But it's a common practice that you can take something, sometimes even somewhat dead, and add new life to it, possibly. And it springs new life. And this is what he's saying, that even though the Jews were God's chosen people, Jesus, because of what he's done for us, now when you confess him as Lord, you are grafted into that family. You're grafted now into being a descendant of Abraham, because it says through the whole world, people will be blessed because of Abraham. And this is the imagery that he gives us. Let's look at it a different way. The man here on my right is Ron Hammer. Ron, as a young adult, had a rough time, and he was into drugs, and one day he was looking for some money, and so he decided, alongside of another guy, to rob a grocery store owner who of the name was Wayne Robinson. And during this grocery store robbery, when the guy was coming back from the bank, it went bad. And Wayne Robinson was shot and was killed. And they both, Ron and this other man, got prison time. And it was thought the whole time that this other man killed Wayne Robinson for $9,000. And when Ron was in prison, he met Jesus. And it was weighing on him so heavily that everybody thought this other guy did it, when Ron was actually the one who pulled the trigger. That after he got saved, about 8 years into his prison sentence, he wrote Wayne's widow a letter confessing that he was the one that pulled the trigger. Well, Wayne's widow and Philip, Wayne's son, were both believers. And it was God put it on their heart to forgive him. And so they went into prison and they met him. Eventually it came time for Ron's parole, and the two people that showed up to plead their case for him to be released was Wayne's widow and Philip. To say, this man's changed. He's different. And after that, when Ron got out of prison, Ron and Philip embraced one another and actually began a life of friendship with one another. Think about that. Would you befriend someone who kills your father? And then Ron and Philip began to tour the country together, sharing their story of what happened and forgiveness. But what did it all start with? It started when Ron confessed to what he did. So what happens is, when we confess Jesus as Lord, it brings us into God's family, or the picture he gives us is being grafted into God's family. In this case, God took two people far apart and brought them in, and they say, now we are like family together. This is the power of the gospel, that once we were far off, but Jesus sets us free with our confession. And the other thing, though, is that Ron and Philip, they go and they share their story of what Jesus has done for them. Crazy to think about. And Paul brings us back to Romans 10 now. It says, you've confessed Jesus as Lord, you're grafted into his family. We could spend hours on talking about the idea of grafting in. And he says this now, but other people need to hear. The Jews, they need to hear. Gentiles also too. He says here back in Romans 14 from chapter 10, he says, but how can they call on him to save him unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they've never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? And how will anyone go and tell them without being sent? That is why the scriptures say, how beautiful are the feet of the messengers who bring good news. Now, in our culture, gross feet aren't really a thing, right? They've created things for that. What do people go do if they have gross feet sometimes? They go get a what? Pedicure, right? I had you answer that, because if I said manicure, I'd have been like laughed off the stage. So they go get a pedicure, right? And you don't want ugly, gross feet. But in this context, a messenger was someone who traveled over mountains, and they brought a message, and he's saying, these are messengers of good news. And so if you were a person who traveled, especially in that context, wearing maybe just some open-toed sandals, your feet were gross. They were nasty. They might even look like that. And so Paul would say, you know what beautiful feet look like? They look like this. Because beautiful feet are worn and torn because they are going out sharing Jesus with other people. This is what the beautiful feet look like. The other thing about beautiful feet is this. The translation of the word beautiful means a timely, seasonable, or right opportune point in time to share the gospel with someone. And so what he's saying is, you might have an opportunity to share Jesus with someone, and he's saying that's a beautiful thing. Or as you go about life, and your feet are worn and torn, and you have the opportunity to share the gospel with someone, that's a beautiful thing. Beautiful thing. Do you have beautiful feet? So Paul is saying, if anybody confesses Jesus as Lord, you're grafted into the family of God, and now it's your job to go and tell other people about that. And you have beautiful feet. But sometimes, right, we're so worried about protecting our feet, we don't tell other people about Jesus. And the flip side of that is you have beautiful feet, but no beautiful message. He says here, but not everyone who welcomes the good news, for Isaiah the prophet said, who has believed our message. So faith comes from hearing, and that is hearing the good news about Jesus. And so people need to hear. People need to go. People need to be sent. They need to have ugly feet, and they need to hear the good news. And oftentimes, as we talk back to the beginning of our series about sharing the gospel this year, oftentimes, right, we would say, well, you know what, I'm just going to do a lot of good things so people notice that I'm different. And we should do that. But there also has to come a hearing. There has to come a point in time where we verbally share the message of Jesus to other people. It comes from hearing. He means that. It comes from hearing the good news of Jesus. I asked AI, ChatGPT, this week, and asked it, does Paul actually mean that we have to, do something with this? He says this. This is what ChatGPT gave me. Theological framework for how people come to saving faith through hearing the message of the gospel, which requires messengers. It's the necessity of belief for salvation, the essential role of hearing the gospel, the need for messengers, and the importance of being sent. So ChatGPT says, this is what Paul says. It requires these things. Now, do we think Paul was talking theory, or was he talking practice? What's he talking? He's talking practice. So the question is, what are we doing? Oftentimes in our church models, we're more about come, know, grow. Come here, know some stuff, and then you grow. There's a part of that. There's a part of that. But you have to get to go, tell, multiply. If all you do is come and know to think you're just going to grow, that's going to leave you someplace. That's intellectual Christianity. Or Paul would say, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. It's great. We need to grow. We need to know. We need to sit under someone, or maybe be mentored by someone, be discipled by someone. We need to come, know, and grow, but you have to finish the equation now of go, tell, and multiply. We have to. As we talked about, beginning of our series, Paul says, for I am not ashamed of the good news about Christ. It is the power of God at work, saving everyone who believes, the Jew first and also the Gentile. This good news tells us how God makes us right in his sight. This is accomplished from start to finish by faith, as the scriptures say. It is through faith that a righteous person has life. The number of leaves we had out there on the wall of seeing God's power at work, and that's the beautiful thing. when you become a person with beautiful feet, you are actually in the opportune time partnering with God on who he's working on, and all you become is the messenger in that. That's the key word. You're not saving the person. You're not doing it for them. You have become the messenger. Let me give us two other things when we think about that idea. And I put it this way. All right. People don't need to be interrogated to give a confession. What they need is good news to confess Jesus as Lord. Right? We want that, right? We might go in, when I say interrogate is, we'll scare someone into it, right? And sometimes, and if you've done this, I'm not shaming anybody, but sometimes our evangelism is like, if you were to die tonight, where would you go? Oh, sign me up for that. Just sign me up for dying tonight, right? How is that good news? It's a beautiful message. It's beautiful feet. We don't need to interrogate someone. Or I've heard testimonies of people saying, you know what? I just kind of did it because that's what everybody else was doing it. They kind of I just raised my hand because I felt pressured into doing that. I got baptized because I was pressured into doing that. No one wants to be interrogated. No one wants to be pressured into confessing Jesus as Lord. And so the ultimate question is, as we become bearers of beautiful news to people, the question we need to ask ourselves is, how does this person need good news in their life? How do they need good news? The gospel's good news for all things and all aspects of life. How does this person need good news in their life? How do they need it? Now, I get it, yes, we are sinners, right? But there's so much that Jesus does for us, and is listening to the person's story, knowing where they're at, to be the bearer of good news, to say, hey, you know what? I got good news for that. This is what Jesus does. Wherever it is. I got good news for that. This is what Jesus does. Good news, right? We might say, oh, someone died in my life. It's good news because God sent his son to die too. He was raised to life. And if you know Jesus, you can be raised to life too. It's good news. There's so much that we don't think through as being good news that we get in these little shticks of what the gospel is when it's so much more for our lives. And so, a couple things as we kind of put this together. The first one is this week, the encouragement is that you would have beautiful feet. Paul is bringing Romans 9, 10, and 11 together, saying that even though my promise has not failed, the gospel is for everyone, but I need messengers for that. I need people to go to the Jews who have turned away. I need people who are going to go to the Gentiles now that the Jews' hearts were hardened. And I'm looking for people with beautiful feet that are my messengers. This week, have beautiful feet. And the goal is, right, to leading people to saving faith in Jesus. That is for all people. The other thing this week is maybe you need to confess. I'm not saying just something, or I'm not looking for you to talk about some crime you committed in 5th grade. It's more so, have you given your life to Jesus? Have you confessed your life? This is what Paul is getting at in Romans 9, 10, and 11. People are getting after Romans 8, and they're like, wait, I see people who should know Jesus, but they don't. And that can be us too. Maybe you've been around Jesus enough. You're a big fan of Jesus. You like his stuff, but you haven't confessed him as Lord in your life. You've never said, I believe you've been raised from the dead. And this is what Jesus is after in our lives as well. So he brings it all together here. He says, if you confess, you're grafted into the family for anybody, Jew or Gentile, but we need messengers for people to hear that news. So this week, you need beautiful feet, you need to confess. If you want to take a next step this week, you can text the word next or scan the QR code. Maybe you want to give your life to Jesus and you want a leader to follow up with you, we can do that. Maybe you want prayer for something, you can do that prayer through that next thing as well. Maybe you want to take another next step that we can help you with, that we can connect you with someone.